Unjustly condemned to the electric chair, she was saved by God after her final words. The execution chamber fell silent as the winter wind howled outside the prison walls. Sarah Miller sat in the electric chair, her hands bound but her spirit unbroken. Snow fell softly beyond the barred windows, each flake a testament to the coldness of justice. The guards exchanged uneasy glances while Father David Parker whispered a final prayer. In the corner, Officer Robert Anderson fought back tears, knowing an innocent soul faced death. As the warden stepped forward to give the final signal, Sarah's voice rang clear through the chamber. "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Before we dive into this powerful story of faith and justice, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments below and hit that like button. Your support means everything to us. In a modest house on the outskirts of Springfield, where paint peeled from wooden walls and winter drafts crept through thin windows, Sarah Miller's day began like any other with prayer. At 42, her face bore the gentle lines of someone who smiled often despite life's hardships. Each morning, she'd wake before dawn to care for her disabled sister Emily, a sweet-natured 26-year-old with cerebral palsy. "Good morning, sunshine," Sarah would whisper, helping Emily from bed to wheelchair. Their morning routine was a dance they'd perfected over years: medications, feeding, dressing, all done with tender patience. Their mother, Grace, now battling late-stage cancer, would watch from her rocking chair, her pride evident in her tired eyes. Their home might have been poor in worldly possessions, but it was rich in love and faith. A worn wooden cross hung above the fireplace, and a well-thumbed Bible lay permanently open on their small kitchen table. Every spare dollar Sarah earned from her work at St. Michael's homeless shelter went toward Emily's care and Grace's mounting medical bills. The shelter's director, Father David Parker, often marveled at Sarah's unwavering spirit. Even on days when she'd work double shifts, she'd stay late to comfort a troubled soul or share her meager lunch with someone hungrier than herself. The homeless knew her as Angel Sarah, though she'd blush and wave away such praise. "The Lord gives us trials to test our faith," she'd often say, "but He never gives us more than we can bear with His help." On Sunday, Sarah would wheel Emily to the front pew of St. Michael's Church, Grace shuffling slowly beside them. The congregation had grown used to Emily's occasional outbursts during service, but Sarah never showed embarrassment, only loving patience. She'd stroke her sister's hand and whisper prayers until calm returned. Their neighbors knew the Millers' struggles. Some brought casseroles or helped with yard work, though most simply offered prayers. Sarah accepted both with equal gratitude. She kept a small garden where she grew vegetables to supplement their modest meals, and in summer she'd always make sure to share the harvest with elderly neighbors. "We might not have much," she'd tell Emily while braiding her hair, "but we have each other, we have our faith, and that makes us richer than any millionaire." Little did Sarah know that her faith would soon be tested beyond anything she could imagine. The threads of tragedy were already weaving themselves into the fabric of her life, though she couldn't yet see the pattern. But even in her darkest hours to come, those who knew her would remember these simple days when Sarah Miller's greatest wealth was her capacity to love, and her only goal was to ease the suffering of others. Each night, before sleep claimed her, Sarah would kneel beside her bed and thank God for another day with her family. "Watch over us, Lord," she'd pray, "and help me be worthy of the blessings you've given me." Those prayers would soon take on a very different tone. Life in Springfield revolved around its seasons, and Sarah's reputation grew like the steadfast oak trees that lined Main Street. At St. Michael's Shelter, she managed to stretch their meager budget, turning simple ingredients into meals that brought comfort to dozens of homeless each day. Her famous potato soup became legendary among the downtrodden, not just for its warmth, but for the dignity with which she served it. "Everyone deserves to be treated like a child of God," she'd say, making sure each person had a clean bowl and proper silverware, no matter their circumstances. The contrast between Sarah's world and Springfield's wealthy elite was stark. While the Thompsons lived in their hilltop mansion, hosting lavish parties that echoed across town, Sarah patched her worn uniform and walked 3 miles to work in all weather to save bus fare. Yet she never showed envy or resentment, even when Catherine Thompson, the family's privileged daughter, would drive past in her new convertible, spattering slush on Sarah's coat. Detective James Wilson, a frequent visitor to the shelter, noticed how Sarah seemed to navigate between these two worlds with grace. He'd watch her interact with both the homeless and the wealthy donors, who occasionally stopped by, treating each with equal respect. That woman, he'd tell his colleagues, has more class than all of Springfield's high society combined. Father Parker saw something special in Sarah, too. He'd witnessed her break up fights between desperate men twice her size, using nothing but gentle words and unwavering compassion. She had a way of looking into people's eyes that made them feel seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in years. "The Lord works through your hands, Sarah," he'd tell her, though she'd shake her head modestly. "I'm just trying to be useful, Father. That's all any of us can do." Even Springfield's cynical newspaper editor, Thomas Reed, found himself moved by Sarah's quiet dedication. He'd featured her in a small article about local heroes, though Sarah had insisted on remaining anonymous. Sometimes he wrote, "The greatest saints walk among us unrecognized." But life wasn't all service and sacrifice. Sarah found joy in simple pleasures, teaching Emily to paint with watercolors. Despite her trembling hands, singing hymns with grace during evening thunderstorms, sharing coffee and conversation with shelter volunteers. Her laugh, when it came, was genuine and infectious. The shelter's regulars formed a kind of family around her. Old Pete, a Vietnam veteran, fixed their ancient heating system for free. Maria Gonzalez, a struggling single mother, would watch Emily when Sarah needed a rare evening off. Even the local grocer, Mr. Jenkins, regularly forgot to charge her for day-old bread and vegetables. Yet dark clouds were gathering. The Thompson family's influence over Springfield cast long shadows, and forces were in motion that would soon shatter Sarah's peaceful world. Her faith, which had always been her strength, would face its greatest test in the tragedy to come. February 13th arrived with a brutal snowstorm that painted Springfield white. Catherine Thompson's body was found at dawn behind St. Michael's shelter, her expensive camel hair coat stained crimson against the snow. Detective James Wilson stood over the scene, watching his breath cloud in the frigid air as crime scene photographers captured the grim tableau. Catherine, the 24-year-old daughter of Springfield's most powerful family, lay posed almost peacefully, as if sleeping. Only the dark bruises around her neck told a different story. Her father, Judge William Thompson, arrived minutes later, his usual commanding presence crumbling at the sight of his daughter. "Find whoever did this," he ordered Wilson, his voice breaking. "Whatever it takes." The pressure was immediate and intense. Local media descended like wolves, their cameras flashing in the winter gloom. The Thompson family's influence meant this wouldn't be just another homicide investigation, it would be a crusade. What sealed Sarah's fate were 3 seemingly damning pieces of circumstance. First, she had been the last person seen with Catherine alive, speaking animatedly outside the shelter the previous evening. Security footage from a nearby bank showed Catherine gesturing angrily before following Sarah behind the building. Second, Catherine's diamond bracelet, a family heirloom, was found in the shelter's dumpster, wrapped in a dish towel bearing Sarah's initials. Third, and most damning, Sarah's fingerprints were found on Catherine's neck. What no one knew was the truth behind that final conversation. Catherine had come to the shelter in secret, troubled by something she'd discovered about her family's business dealings. She'd sought out Sarah, known for her discretion and wisdom, hoping to unburden her conscience. The argument caught on camera was Catherine insisting on speaking privately, away from prying eyes. "I have to tell someone," Catherine had pleaded. "I can't live with this anymore." But before she could reveal her secret, someone else had been watching, someone with everything to lose if Catherine spoke up. The morning Catherine's body was discovered, Sarah arrived at work early as usual. She noticed police cars surrounding the shelter but thought little of it. Their neighborhood often saw police activity. It wasn't until Detective Wilson approached her, his face grave, that her world began to tilt. "Sarah Miller," he said, not meeting her eyes, "I need you to come with me." "Of course, Detective," she replied, still unaware of how her life was about to change. "Let me just call someone to cover my shift." "That won't be necessary," Wilson said, producing handcuffs. "Sarah Miller, you're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Thompson." The words seemed to hang in the frozen air, impossible and surreal. Father Parker, arriving for morning mass, watched in horror as Sarah was led away. The homeless people gathering for breakfast stood silent, their faces masks of disbelief. Old Pete dropped his coffee cup, the sound of shattering ceramic eerily final in the morning stillness. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Detective, I would never." "You have the right to remain silent," Wilson cut her off, reciting the Miranda rights mechanically while avoiding the eyes of those who knew Sarah best. As she was led to the police car, Sarah caught sight of Judge Thompson watching from across the street. His face was a storm of grief and rage, and in that moment she knew no matter what the truth was, he would make sure someone paid for his daughter's death. Snow continued to fall, erasing footprints and evidence alike, as Sarah was driven away from everything she knew and loved, toward a darkness she could not yet imagine. The Springfield police station buzzed with unusual energy as Sarah was processed. News of Catherine Thompson's murder had spread like wildfire, and the daughter of a prominent judge being killed behind a homeless shelter was too sensational for the media to ignore. Television vans crowded the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metallic flowers seeking winter sun. Detective Wilson sat across from Sarah in the interrogation room, his face illuminated harshly by fluorescent lights. The weight of political pressure was evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his coffee cup. "Just tell me what happened," Sarah said, softer than protocol dictated. "Make this easier for everyone." Sarah's response remained consistent. "I spoke with Catherine about a private matter. She was alive when I left her. I went home to Emily and Mother. That's all I know." But the evidence mounted with suspicious efficiency. An anonymous tip led police to Sarah's coat, found in her basement with traces of Catherine's blood. A shelter resident, Jerry Banks, suddenly remembered hearing an argument and Sarah's distinctive voice saying, "You'll regret this." The case seemed to build itself, each piece falling into place too perfectly. Meanwhile, at the Miller home, chaos erupted. Grace collapsed upon hearing the news and was rushed to the hospital. Emily, unable to comprehend why her sister hadn't come home, became increasingly agitated. Social services arrived by evening, citing concerns about Emily's care in Grace's absence. "Please," Grace begged from her hospital bed, "she needs familiar surroundings. She needs routine." But the system was already in motion, as inexorable as the justice that was bearing down on Sarah. Emily was taken to state care, her screams echoing through the hospital corridors. At the police station, Judge Thompson made an appearance, his grief transformed into cold fury. He stood in the observation room watching Sarah through one-way glass. "I want special prosecutors," he told the district attorney. "I want every resource focused on this case. My Catherine deserves justice." The DA nodded, understanding the unspoken message. This case would make or break careers. Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, Michael Brooks, arrived looking more interested in networking than defending his client. He barely glanced at the case file before advising Sarah to consider a plea deal. "The evidence is overwhelming," he said, straightening his expensive tie. "A plea might spare you the death penalty." "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do," Sarah replied quietly. "God knows the truth." Brooks smiled condescendingly. God doesn't try cases in Springfield, Mrs. Miller. Judge Thompson does. As Sarah was led to her cell that night, Officer Robert Anderson watched her with growing unease. Something about the case felt wrong, the evidence too neat, the witness too convenient, the pressure too intense. Mrs. Miller, he called softly through the bars. I'm sorry about your sister. I'll try to check on her. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you. Please tell her I love her." That night, as Springfield's elite gathered at the Thompson mansion to offer condolences, Sarah knelt in her cell and prayed, not for herself, but for Catherine's soul, for Emily's safety, for her mother's health, and even for those who were falsely accusing her. Outside, reporters filmed their segments against the backdrop of the jail, their words painting Sarah as a murderous wolf in shepherd's clothing. The question remains, one reporter concluded dramatically, how well do we really know those who serve our community? The stage was set for what would become the most controversial trial in Springfield's history, and Sarah Miller's desperate fight for survival was just beginning. This incredible woman's strength and compassion deserve a simple like. It's surprising that no one has appreciated her story yet. Will you be the first? The Springfield County Courthouse stood imposing against the gray February sky as Sarah's trial began. Snow continued to fall, dusting the shoulders of protesters who gathered outside, some demanding justice for Catherine, others holding vigils for Sarah. The national media had descended upon the small town, turning a tragedy into a spectacle. Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat beside Michael Brooks, her court-appointed lawyer, who seemed more interested in catching the eye of news cameras than reviewing case notes. Her once neat uniform had been replaced by prison orange, but she held herself with quiet dignity, a worn Bible clutched in her trembling hands. Judge Raymond Harrison, a longtime golf partner of William Thompson, presided. His attempts at impartiality were betrayed by subtle glances toward the Thompson family's private box, where Catherine's parents sat surrounded by Springfield's elite. The prosecution, led by ambitious District Attorney Victoria Pierce, painted Sarah as a manipulative predator who used her position at the shelter to mask darker intentions. Behind that mask of Christian charity, Pierce declared in her opening statement, lurked a woman consumed by jealousy of the privileged life Catherine Thompson represented. Brooks's defense was perfunctory at best. He barely challenged the prosecution's witnesses, failed to present Sarah's alibi evidence, and seemed to wilt under Judge Harrison's stern gaze. When Sarah tried to point out inconsistencies in testimony, Brooks silenced her with sharp whispers. The prosecution's star witness, Jerry Banks, delivered his rehearsed testimony with suspicious precision. I heard them arguing, he claimed, his newly pressed suit a stark contrast to his usual shelter attire. Mrs. Miller said she'd make Catherine pay for looking down on people like us. Father Parker, called to testify about Sarah's character, found his testimony constantly interrupted by prosecution objections, most of which Judge Harrison sustained. The chaplain's frustration was visible as he was forced to give only yes or no answers, unable to explain the full context of Sarah's dedication to the community. Officer Anderson, watching from the gallery during his off-duty hours, noticed something odd. Every time Jerry Banks testified, Detective Wilson would shift uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. The Thompson family's private security detail seemed to hover especially close to Banks during breaks. The most damaging moment came when the prosecution presented Sarah's blood-stained coat. What the jury didn't hear was that the basement where it was found had an exterior entrance that was often unlocked, a fact Brooks failed to mention. Your Honor, Sarah finally spoke up during a particularly skewed piece of testimony. Please, there's something the jury needs to know. Mrs. Miller, Judge Harrison cut her off sharply. You will speak only through your counsel. One more outburst and you'll be removed from this courtroom. In the gallery, Grace Miller watched in anguish, her cancer-weakened body supported by church members. Each day of the trial seemed to age her another year. Emily's absence was a painful void. She remained in state care, her routine disrupted, her condition deteriorating without her sister's care. As the first week of trial concluded, Sarah overheard Brooks in the courthouse corridor speaking to Da Pierce. "Look, we both know how this ends. Let's just make it quick and clean." That evening in her cell, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Lord, I understand now why Jesus remained silent before his accusers. Sometimes there are no words that can overcome hearts determined not to hear truth. But please protect Emily. She's innocent in all this." The trial was rushing toward its inevitable conclusion, orchestrated by forces Sarah was only beginning to understand. But in the darkness of her cell, she held on to one certainty: God hadn't abandoned her yet. And somewhere in this web of lies, truth was fighting to emerge. The verdict came on a bitterly cold afternoon as shadows lengthened across the courthouse floor. Snow had turned to freezing rain, drumming against the windows like nature's own protest against what was about to unfold. In the matter of the state versus Sarah Miller, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word fell like an executioner's axe. Sarah stood motionless, her faith visibly warring with despair. Behind her, Grace collapsed into silent sobs, supported by Father Parker. Judge Harrison's gavel crack echoed through the stunned courtroom. Sarah Miller Harrison intoned, his voice carrying rehearsed gravity, "Given the heinous nature of this crime and your abuse of community trust, I see no alternative but to impose the maximum penalty. I hereby sentence you to death by electrocution." The Thompson family exchanged satisfied glances. William Thompson placed a possessive hand on his younger daughter Amanda's shoulder, but those watching closely might have noticed her slight flinch at his touch. "Does the defendant wish to make a statement?" Harrison asked perfunctorily. Sarah's voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "I forgive those who have condemned me today. I pray that God shows them more mercy than they have shown me. And to my sister Emily, I'm sorry I won't be there to brush your hair tonight." The raw simplicity of her words sparked an outbreak of weeping in the gallery. Even some jurors looked away, suddenly uncertain. Officer Anderson, standing guard, noticed Da Pierce quickly pocket a note passed to her by Jerry Banks. Something in that furtive exchange hardened his growing suspicions. As Sarah was led away, Grace fought through her weakness to reach her daughter. "Sarah, I'll find a way. We'll appeal." Her words dissolved into a coughing fit that brought blood to her lips. "Take care of Emily," Mother Sarah called back. "Just take care of Emily." But fate had other plans. The stress of the trial had accelerated Grace's cancer. Within weeks of the verdict, she would be gone, leaving Emily truly alone in state care. Michael Brooks, his job done, was seen celebrating at the exclusive Springfield Country Club that evening. His performance in deliberately losing the case had earned him a partnership track at the city's most prestigious firm. The media circus exploded. Cable news painted Sarah as everything from a calculating killer to a victim of class warfare. Newspapers dubbed it the shelter slaying, running side-by-side photos of Catherine's privileged smile and Sarah's mugshot. Father Parker immediately launched an appeal fund, but potential donors mysteriously backed out after receiving calls from Thompson family associates. The fix was in, deep and thorough. Back in her death row cell, Sarah knelt in prayer. A guard later reported hearing her whisper, "Lord, like Job, I accept this cup, but please send someone to uncover the truth. Not for me, but for justice itself." That same night, Officer Anderson sat in his cramped apartment, spreading out photocopied case files on his kitchen table. Something Judge Harrison had said about abuse of community trust kept echoing in his mind. He began connecting dots: the rushed investigation, the convenient evidence, Brooks's suspicious incompetence. Meanwhile, in the Thompson mansion, Amanda Thompson lay awake, tormented by knowledge she dared not speak. Her father's study light burned late into the night as he made phone calls, ensuring all loose ends were tied up. But truth has a way of refusing to stay buried, and the real story behind Catherine Thompson's death was about to emerge in ways none of them could have predicted. Death row at Springfield State Penitentiary wasn't designed for women. Sarah's cell, converted from a storage room, felt like a tomb 6 by 8 feet of concrete and steel, with a narrow window that offered a cruel slice of sky. The winter wind whistled through gaps in the aging walls, but the real cold came from isolation. Her days fell into a monotonous rhythm: wake at 5 a.m., pray, exercise in the confined space, then 23 hours of solitude. That 1 hour of yard time became precious, even though it meant enduring the stares and whispers of other inmates who'd seen her case on TV. Officer Robert Anderson increasingly found reasons to patrol her section. He'd pause at her cell, seemingly for routine checks, but his eyes held questions he couldn't yet voice. Sometimes he'd slip her extra blankets or books, small kindnesses that risked his job. My sister Emily, Sarah would ask whenever she saw him, "Have you heard anything?" Anderson's reports were usually grim. Emily, overwhelmed by changes and separation, had retreated into herself. The state facility struggled to manage her needs, and without Grace's presence or Sarah's care, her condition deteriorated. Father Parker visited twice weekly, bringing communion and news from outside. He noticed how Sarah had begun teaching other inmates through the cell bars, reading lessons, simple prayers, even humming hymns to calm the troubled ones during night terrors. "You've turned death row into a ministry," he observed one day. Sarah managed a small smile. "Everyone needs hope, Father, even here, especially here." The prison chaplain, initially skeptical of her conviction, became one of her strongest advocates. He watched as she transformed the atmosphere of death row through small acts of kindness, offering her breakfast to a hungry inmate, counseling a suicidal woman through air vents, teaching a young mother to read so she could write to her children. But nights were the hardest. In darkness, memories flooded back: Emily's laugh during their morning routine, Grace's gentle hymn singing, Catherine Thompson's desperate whispers at final evening. Sarah would grip her Bible tight, its pages already worn from constant reading, and pray for strength to endure another day. One morning, breaking her usual stoicism, Sarah asked Anderson what happened to Jerry Banks, the witness. Anderson's face tightened. "Funny you should ask. He's got a new job. Security at Thompson Industries. New apartment, too. Quite a step up from the shelter." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Winter deepened outside, but Sarah's cell became a quiet hub of prison life. Women would find excuses to pass by, seeking a kind word or prayer. Even hardened guards found themselves pausing to listen when she sang hymns in the evening. "You know what's weird?" a young guard commented to Anderson. "The worse things get for her, the stronger she seems to become." Indeed, Sarah appeared to draw strength from adversity. When news came of Grace's declining health, she channeled her grief into helping a fellow inmate cope with her own mother's death. When she heard Emily had been sedated after a particularly bad episode, she spent the night counseling another prisoner's disabled brother through the mail. But there were cracks in her armor. Sharp-eyed observers might notice her hands trembling during prayers, or catch her staring at family photos with red-rimmed eyes. The prison psychiatrist noted how she'd begun talking to Emily's photo at night, as if maintaining their old bedtime routine. Father Parker brought the news of Grace's death on a particularly bitter February morning. Sarah received it in silence, then asked only for time to pray. The guards reported hearing her weeping that night, her usual hymns replaced by quiet sobs. The next day she was back to helping others, her voice perhaps a little softer, her smile a bit more fragile. When Anderson tried to express condolences, she stopped him. "God has a purpose," she said firmly, "even for this, especially for this." But late that night, alone in her cell, she added a new prayer: "Lord, I accepted my cup, but please don't let Emily suffer for my trials. Send someone to watch over her." And if there's truth to be found, let it come to light before more innocent lives are destroyed. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on Springfield, covering both mansions and graves with the same impartial white, while within the prison walls an unlikely alliance was forming, one that would soon shake the very foundations of justice in their small town. Grace Miller's funeral was held on a Thursday morning, with Sarah watching from her cell via a grainy Polaroid Father Parker had smuggled in. The photograph showed a sparse gathering. Most of Springfield still believed Sarah guilty, and fear of Thompson family reprisals kept many former friends away. Emily wasn't there. Her state facility deemed the funeral too destabilizing for her condition. She spent that day sedated, unaware she'd lost both mother and sister within months. The social worker's reports, which Anderson quietly shared with Sarah, painted a heartbreaking picture. Emily now spent days staring at the wall, refusing food unless it was served the way Sarah used to prepare it. She keeps asking for her sister, the report noted, becomes violent when told Mrs. Miller can't come. That night, Sarah's faith faced its darkest test. Kneeling in her cell, she struggled to pray, the words catching in her throat. "Why, Lord," she whispered, "I accepted my fate, but Emily, she's innocent. She needs me." The prison cameras caught her pacing until dawn, clutching her mother's worn rosary. By morning, her hair had streaks of gray that hadn't been there before. Officer Anderson, watching this decline, intensified his unofficial investigation. He began spending his off hours following Jerry Banks, noting the witness's suspicious new lifestyle. A man who once couldn't afford shelter meals now dined at Springfield's finest restaurants. His new apartment, Anderson discovered, was paid for by a Thompson Industries subsidiary. Father Parker, meanwhile, fought his own battles. The diocese, pressured by wealthy donors, suggested he distance himself from the Miller case. His refusal cost the shelter several major contributions. "They can take our funding," he told his congregation, "but they cannot take our conscience." The shelter's attendance dropped as Thompson-owned businesses began keeping lists of those who supported Sarah. Old Pete, still maintaining the shelter's heating system, reported conversations he'd overheard, plans to close the shelter, rezone the land, erase this reminder of Springfield's unfortunate incident. Sarah received these reports with outward calm, but her prison journal revealed deeper turmoil. "Mother, forgive me for not being there at the end. Emily, my sweet Emily, I promised to always protect you. Now you're alone, scared, and I can't reach you. Catherine, what secret was worth your life? Some nights I wonder if this is Job's test or Judas's curse." The breaking point came when Anderson brought news about Emily's transfer to a long-term state institution in another county. The facility was known for its heavy use of sedation to manage difficult cases. For the first time, Sarah's composure shattered completely. She collapsed against the cell bars, sobbing with such raw anguish that even seasoned guards had to look away. That evening, she refused dinner and didn't sing her usual hymns. Father Parker found her the next morning, still kneeling, her lips moving in silent prayer. But something had changed. The gentle shelter worker was gone. In her place knelt a woman of steel, tempered by loss and injustice. "Father," she said, her voice carrying new resolve, "I've been praying for a miracle. But perhaps God is waiting for us to create one." Her words proved prophetic. That same day, Amanda Thompson, Catherine's younger sister, began experiencing severe panic attacks. Her psychiatrist noted her increasing agitation whenever her father discussed Sarah's case. In her therapy sessions, she'd begun drawing compulsively scenes of the shelter, dark figures, her sister's final moments. Meanwhile, Officer Anderson discovered something curious. The blood on Sarah's coat didn't match Catherine's type. This detail had been buried in the lab reports, marked as inconclusive and never presented at trial. Sarah felt these currents of change even in her isolation. Her prayers shifted from pleas for relief to requests for guidance. Her journal's final entry from this period read, "Mother's gone to God. Emily's lost in a system I can't reach. Everything I built at the shelter may crumble, But truth is like water, it finds its way through any crack. Catherine knew this. Perhaps that's why she died. And perhaps that's why I must live to see that truth flow free, whatever the cost. As Springfield's winter deepened toward spring, the pieces of a puzzle began shifting into place. But for Sarah, locked in her cell while Emily suffered and her life's work crumbled, the cost of waiting for justice was becoming almost too much to bear. 7 months after her conviction, the order came. Sarah Miller was to be executed by electrocution in 14 days. The news arrived on a bitter December morning, delivered by the warden himself. February 14th, midnight, he stated clinically. Valentine's Day. The irony of the date, a day of love, becoming her day of death, wasn't lost on anyone. Sarah received the news with characteristic grace, though observers noted her hand trembled slightly as she signed the death warrant acknowledgement. The final countdown began with cruel precision. Prison protocol dictated every moment: last visits, last appeals, last rites. Sarah's only request was to see Emily one final time. The petition was denied due to Emily's unstable condition, a bureaucratic cruelty that even hardened guards found difficult to stomach. Father Parker arrived daily now, his aging face drawn with worry. The appeals court refused to hear new evidence, he reported grimly. Judge Thompson's influence reaches far. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. And Emily? In the new facility, he hesitated. They've increased her sedation. She's barely responsive now. For a moment, Sarah's composure cracked. She pressed her forehead against the cold bar, shoulders shaking silently. When she looked up, her eyes held a pain deeper than fear of death. Officer Anderson, now working death row shifts by choice, watched her prepare for the end with mounting frustration. His investigation had uncovered damning evidence: Jerry Banks's new lifestyle, suspicious transfers from Thompson Industries, irregularities in Catherine's autopsy report. But every attempt to present this evidence met bureaucratic walls. 7 days before the execution, Sarah was moved to the death watch cell, a bare concrete box with 24-hour observation. Her possessions were reduced to a Bible, her mother's rosary, and a photo of Emily. Guards noted how she spent hours tracing her sister's face through the plastic sleeve. The media circus intensified. Television crews camped outside the prison, their lights creating false dawn in the winter darkness. Inside, Sarah began her final preparations with ritual dignity. She gave away her few possessions, her spare uniform to a shivering new inmate, her small Bible collection to the prison library, her journal to Officer Anderson. "Make sure Emily knows I never stopped loving her," she told him. 3 days out, she wrote her final letter to Emily, though she knew her sister might never comprehend it. "My dearest Emily, when you were born, I promised to protect you always. Forgiveness is hard when that promise breaks. But we'll meet again where all promises are kept, where no one needs protection anymore. Until then, remember how we used to say goodnight. God loves you. I love you. Angels watch over you. Your loving sister, Sarah." Oh. The prison chaplain found her weeping after writing it, the only time she'd broken down since the execution date was set. 2 days remained. Sarah's last meal request reflected her character: whatever the kitchen is serving everyone else. But please make sure Emily gets her favorite apple pudding today. The death house team began their preparations. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky by inmates, was tested, its generator humming like a waiting beast. Sarah could hear it from her cell, a sound that made even the most hardened guards uncomfortable. Her final visitor was Amanda Thompson, appearing without her father's knowledge. The meeting was brief, tense, and closely monitored. Observers noted both women crying, though no one could hear their whispered exchange. Amanda left looking physically ill, her face haunted. On her last night, Sarah requested permission to sing hymns. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried through death row: "Amazing Grace, how great thou art," and finally Emily's favorite lullaby. Hardened criminals wept in their cells. Even the warden, listening from his office, had to turn away. Hours from execution, Sarah knelt in her cell one last time. Officer Anderson, standing guard, heard her whisper, "Lord, like your son, I fear this cup. But if my death must come, let it serve your purpose. Let truth prevail. Protect Emily, and forgive them, they know not what they do." Outside, a winter storm was building, its first flakes swirling against the prison windows. No one could have predicted how this night would end, how weather, faith, and long-buried truths were about to collide in a way that would shake Springfield to its core. The clock ticked toward midnight, each second bringing Sarah closer to her appointment with old Sparky. But somewhere in the gathering storm, forces both natural and divine were moving, preparing to unleash something beyond anyone's control. At 11:45 p.m., the death house came alive with final preparations. Thunder rumbled overhead as Sarah was led from her cell, her steps steady despite the shackles. Officer Anderson and Father Parker flanked her, each fighting their own private battles with duty and faith. The walk to the execution chamber, 50 steps that felt like 50 miles. Sarah's bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling through the prison's ancient architecture like lost souls crying out for mercy. "Any last words?" the warden asked mechanically. Sarah raised her eyes to the witnesses gathered behind glass. Judge Thompson sat front row, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Amanda Thompson wasn't present. She'd been sedated after a severe panic attack hours earlier. "I forgive those who brought me here," Sarah began, her voice clear above the storm. "And I pray that God reveals truth in His own time. Emily, my sweet sister, angels watch over you." Lightning struck nearby with a deafening crack, plunging the chamber into darkness. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The electric chair's generator hummed ominously, then sputtered into silence. "Backup power," the warden barked, but his words were drowned by another thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the prison. In that moment of chaos, something extraordinary happened. Witnesses would later describe it differently. Some saw a bright light, others felt an inexplicable warmth. A few claimed to smell roses in the dead of winter. What they all agreed on was the profound sense that something beyond human understanding had entered that room. Sarah, strapped in the chair, began to pray. Not in fear or desperation, but with a serene authority that commanded attention. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Officer Anderson, standing guard, noticed something odd. Jerry Banks, required to witness the execution as part of the trial record, had begun trembling violently. The man's face contorted with what looked like physical pain each time Sarah's prayer mentioned truth or justice. Suddenly, Banks broke. "I can't," he screamed. "God forgive me, I can't let this happen." The room froze. Even the storm seemed to pause. "It wasn't her," Banks continued, his words tumbling out like a confession. "I was paid to lie. The Thompson family, they made me say I saw things, but I didn't see anything." Catherine was already dead when Sarah found her. Judge Thompson lunged forward, but Anderson moved faster, blocking his path. The warden, his protocol in shambles, looked uncertainly between Sarah and his superiors. Another lightning strike illuminated the room like God's own spotlight. In that flash, Father Parker saw something fall from Judge Thompson's coat, a small notebook that skidded across the floor to rest at Sarah's feet. Catherine's diary. No, Thompson's voice cracked with panic rather than authority. But it was too late. Anderson had already snatched up the book, his trained eye catching entries about corporate corruption, offshore accounts, and a daughter's growing horror at her family's crimes. The storm reached its crescendo. Rain lashed against the windows with biblical fury as the truth Catherine had tried to share that fatal night began to emerge. She'd discovered her father's criminal empire, had gathered evidence, had sought Sarah's help to expose it all. "The killer," Banks whispered, his resistance finally broken, "was hired by the judge. I saw him leave that night. Catherine was a liability they couldn't control. In the midst of this chaos, Sarah remained eerily calm, as if she'd known all along that God would choose his moment. The same faith that had sustained her through loss and imprisonment now radiated from her like a physical force. The warden, faced with an unprecedented situation, finally made the call execution suspended pending investigation. As guards began unstrapping Sarah, the storm abruptly calmed. The backup generators hummed to life, flooding the room with harsh light that revealed Judge Thompson being restrained, Jerry Banks sobbing in a corner, and witnesses standing in shocked silence. Officer Anderson moved to help Sarah stand, but she was already rising on her own, her face bearing an expression of profound peace. "God's timing is perfect," she said softly. "Always perfect." Outside, the clouds parted, revealing a star-filled sky. The winter storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a transformed landscape, both physical and moral, in the small town of Springfield. But for Sarah, this divine intervention was only the beginning. The real miracle would be what came next. In all my years sharing stories of faith and miracles, Sarah's journey has touched me deeply. If her story of unwavering faith moved you too, please consider subscribing to our channel. Together we can share more powerful testimonies that remind us of God's endless grace and perfect timing. Dawn broke over Springfield with an unsettling clarity. The storm had scoured the air clean, leaving behind a crystalline winter morning that seemed to mock the chaos unfolding within the prison walls. News of the halted execution and Judge Thompson's dramatic arrest spread like wildfire. National media descended on the small town, their satellite trucks creating a makeshift city in the prison parking lot. Justice interrupted divine intervention, or divine providence scrolled across television screens nationwide. Sarah remained in custody while the investigation expanded, but her status had changed dramatically. She was moved from death row to a minimum security wing, where Emily was finally allowed to visit. Their reunion brought hardened guards to tears. Sarah Emily wheeled herself forward, her trembling hands reaching out. "They said you went away like Mama." "Never again," sweet girl Sarah whispered, holding her sister close. "God brought me back to you." Officer Anderson worked tirelessly with state investigators, unraveling a web of corruption that stretched back decades. Catherine Thompson's diary proved invaluable, detailing her father's criminal enterprise with meticulous precision. Each page revealed how the young woman's conscience had driven her to seek Sarah's help, a fatal decision that had sealed both their fates. Jerry Banks, now in protective custody, provided testimony that implicated not only Judge Thompson but several high-ranking officials in Springfield's government. His detailed confession revealed how evidence had been planted, witnesses intimidated, and justice perverted. Sarah Miller was chosen, he explained to investigators, because she was everything the Thompsons weren't: poor, devout, devoted to others. The perfect scapegoat. Who would believe her over a judge? Father Parker, vindicated in his support of Sarah, faced his own challenges. The diocese, embarrassed by their earlier abandonment of her cause, now scrambled to show support. His response was characteristically direct: the church should have stood for truth from the beginning. Our delayed justice is its own form of sin. The shelter, nearly closed during Sarah's imprisonment, became a hub for media and supporters. Old Pete maintained his post at the heating system, now telling reporters proudly how he never doubted Miss Sarah for a minute. Maria Gonzalez organized a support group for families affected by wrongful convictions. But the most dramatic development came from an unexpected source. Amanda Thompson, recovered from her breakdown, came forward with security camera footage she'd secretly preserved. The video showed a hired killer entering the shelter's back entrance minutes after Catherine's meeting with Sarah. More importantly, it showed Judge Thompson himself arriving shortly after, ensuring his daughter's silence was permanent. "I couldn't live with it anymore," Amanda told investigators, her voice shaking. "Catherine was trying to do the right thing. Sarah was innocent. The storm, It was like God himself was demanding the truth. The evidence mounted daily. Thompson Industries records revealed a complex network of bribes, offshore accounts, and criminal conspiracies. The corporate empire began to crumble as shareholders fled and indictments multiplied. Sarah watched these developments with characteristic grace, offering prayers for all involved, even Judge Thompson. When reporters asked about revenge, she quoted scripture, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." But privately, in quiet moments with Emily, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd endured. "I never lost faith," she told her sister, "but some nights it was only your memory that kept me holding on." As winter deepened toward spring, Springfield began its own painful healing process. The town had to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the cost of silence. But like the storm that had interrupted Sarah's execution, sometimes destruction paves the way for renewal. And in her cell, now decorated with Emily's artwork and cards from supporters worldwide, Sarah continued to pray not for vindication, but for transformation. The real miracle, she believed, was still unfolding. The investigation into Springfield's justice system revealed a rot so deep it threatened to shake public faith in the entire state's legal framework. As federal investigators combed through decades of cases, a pattern emerged of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. Michael Brooks, Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, was among the first to fall. Evidence showed he had deliberately sabotaged multiple cases in exchange for Thompson family favors. His partnership track had been bought with the freedom of innocent clients. How many others, Sarah asked when Anderson showed her the growing list of compromised cases. How many souls are buried in prison cells because of this? The answer was heartbreaking. 23 wrongful convictions tied directly to Judge Thompson. 15 lives ended by death row executions now proven suspicious. Hundreds of cases requiring review. District Attorney Victoria Pierce attempted suicide when her role was exposed, leaving behind a confession that detailed how she'd helped orchestrate Sarah's prosecution. "I knew she was innocent," Pierce wrote, "but career advancement meant more to me than justice. God forgive me." The media circus intensified. Cable news networks ran special reports. Springfield's shamed justice for sale. National newspapers dispatched investigative teams. Each day brought new revelations. Prison contracts steered to Thompson Industries. Judges bought with offshore accounts. Evidence routinely planted or destroyed. Witnesses paid or threatened into silence. Springfield's entire legal establishment faced scrutiny. The State Bar Association launched ethics investigations into dozens of lawyers. 3 judges resigned. The police department underwent federal review. But the human cost proved most devastating. Families torn apart by wrongful convictions. Lives destroyed by manufactured evidence. Innocent people who'd accepted plea deals under pressure, their futures sacrificed to feed the Thompson family's power. Emily, watching news coverage from her hospital room, struggled to understand. "Why did they hurt you, Sarah? Why did they take you away?" Sarah had no easy answers, but her response captured national attention. Evil thrives when good people choose comfort over conscience. But God's light always breaks through darkness. Sometimes it just takes a storm to clear the sky. The aftermath hit Springfield's poor communities hardest. Many had lost faith in the system meant to protect them. The homeless shelter's attendance dropped as people feared becoming the next Sarah Miller, another convenient scapegoat for the powerful. Father Parker organized community meetings to help people process their anger and fear. "We must rebuild," he urged, "not just our justice system, but our trust in each other." Anderson, now working with federal investigators, discovered something that haunted him. An earlier attempt to expose the corruption had been silenced. A young journalist who'd probed too deeply had died in an apparent car accident 5 years before Catherine's murder. It wasn't just about saving their empire, he realized. They enjoyed the power of playing God with people's lives. The most chilling revelation came from prison records. 3 other death row inmates had experienced mysterious equipment failures during their executions, but unlike Sarah, their executions had proceeded once power was restored. All 3 cases were now under review. Sarah's story became a rallying cry for justice reform. Civil rights organizations cited her case in campaigns against the death penalty. Legal scholars studied the Springfield scandal as an example of systemic corruption. But for Sarah, watching from her cell as the system imploded, justice felt incomplete. Each new revelation added weight to Catherine's final, desperate attempt to expose the truth. Each disclosed case represented another life shattered by greed and power. The storm that saved me, she told Father Parker, was just the beginning. The real tempest is only now breaking. She was right. As winter turned to spring, the winds of change sweeping through Springfield would uproot not just corruption, but the very foundations of power in the small town. And Sarah Miller's role in that transformation was far from over. On a cold March morning, Amanda Thompson walked into the federal prosecutor's office carrying a locked metal box. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the desk, her face pale but determined. "I found this in Catherine's secret safe," she said. "The combination was our mother's birthday. Father never knew about it." Inside lay the missing pieces of a puzzle Catherine had died trying to solve. USB drives, financial records, and a personal diary that detailed years of Thompson Industries' criminal activities. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded conversations. Catherine was smarter than they knew, Amanda explained, her voice breaking. She wore a wire for months. Every meeting, every threat, every plan, she recorded it all. The recordings revealed a shocking truth: Catherine's murder had been planned weeks before her death. Judge Thompson, discovering his daughter's investigation, had set in motion an elaborate scheme. Sarah Miller wasn't just a convenient scapegoat. She was chosen specifically because her reputation for goodness would make her fall more devastating to the community's morale. "Break their saint," Judge Thompson was heard saying, "and you break their spirit." One recording captured Catherine's final conversation with Sarah at the shelter. "Catherine, I need your help. They're killing people, Sarah. Not just with corrupt trials. Real murders covered up as accidents. Sarah, Catherine, you need to go to the authorities." "Catherine, the authorities are part of it. You're the only person in Springfield everyone trusts. The only one they couldn't buy." The conversation ended with footsteps approaching. Catherine's last words were a frightened whisper, "Oh God, he's here." Officer Anderson, listening to the recordings, finally understood why Sarah had been targeted. She wasn't just convenient, he told federal investigators. She was a threat to their whole system because she couldn't be corrupted. But the revelations didn't stop there. Amanda produced evidence that Michael Brooks, Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, had been on Thompson Industries' payroll for years. His role was to ensure defendants never mounted an effective defense. He called them sacrificial lambs, Amanda said, her disgust evident. Poor people whose convictions would help hide the real crimes. The most heartbreaking discovery was a file detailing how the Thompsons had manipulated Emily's care after Sarah's arrest. Her transfer to a harsh state facility wasn't due to her condition worsening, it was punishment designed to break Sarah's spirit. As federal agents processed the new evidence, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Jerry Banks, now in witness protection, had requested a meeting to beg forgiveness. "I was weak," he sobbed. "They own my soul with money, but you showed me what real strength looks like." Sarah's response reflected her unchanged heart. "God forgives you, Jerry, so do I." The evidence painted a picture of corruption so vast it stunned even hardened investigators. Thompson Industries had effectively owned Springfield's justice system for decades. Judges, lawyers, police officers, all were implicated in a network of bribery and intimidation. But Catherine's secret recordings revealed something else: a daughter's desperate attempt to save her father's soul. In private conversations with Amanda, she expressed hope that exposing the corruption might force their father to seek redemption. She loved him, Amanda explained to Sarah. Even at the end, she believed he could change. That's why she came to you. She thought if anyone could help him find his way back to God, it would be you. This revelation hit Sarah hard. In her prison journal, she wrote, "Catherine died trying to save not just victims of injustice, but her father's soul as well. Her last act was one of love, desperate, hopeful love." As spring sunlight began to pierce Springfield's long winter, Sarah's case moved toward its final resolution. But the truth had unleashed forces that would transform not just her fate, but the very fabric of justice in their small town. And in her cell, Sarah continued to pray, not just for her freedom, but for healing for all involved, even those who had tried to destroy her. The transformation of Springfield began not with a bang, but with a quiet vigil. 100 citizens, then 500, then thousands gathered outside the courthouse, holding candles in the spring twilight. Each person wore a simple white ribbon, Sarah's favorite symbol of faith. The movement started organically after Amanda Thompson's evidence went public. Local churches, initially hesitant to challenge the Thompson family's power, now opened their doors for justice rallies. The wealthy and poor stood shoulder to shoulder, united by shared outrage. Sarah Miller wasn't just wrongly convicted, Father Parker declared to the crowds. She was chosen because she represented everything that threatens corruption: unshakable faith, incorruptible spirit, and love for all humanity, even her persecutors. The national media dubbed it the Springfield Awakening. Civil rights organizations descended on the town. But what made this movement unique was its tone, not of vengeance, but of redemption. Sarah's influence was evident in the protesters' methods. When angry crowds gathered outside Thompson Industries, calling for revenge, shelter residents led them in prayer instead. Old Pete organized peaceful sit-ins. Maria Gonzalez started a support group for families of wrongfully convicted inmates. The Thompson family's empire crumbled quickly. Major shareholders, faced with evidence of decades of corruption, abandoned ship. But it was the personal revelations that truly shocked Springfield's elite. Judge Thompson had ordered hits on business rivals, disguised as accidents. Poor neighborhoods had been deliberately kept destitute through manipulated zoning laws. Even the church had been infiltrated, with donations used to buy silence. Amanda Thompson, now the unexpected face of reform, worked tirelessly to right her family's wrongs. She converted the Thompson mansion into a halfway house for released inmates. The family's offshore accounts, once recovered, funded a legal clinic for the poor. Catherine died trying to expose the truth, Amanda told reporters. "The least I can do is live to implement change." The movement spread beyond Springfield. Other towns began examining their own justice systems. Sarah's case became a catalyst for national dialogue about wealth, power, and the true meaning of justice. Inside the prison, Sarah continued her ministry, now aided by official support. She counseled inmates, taught literacy classes, and helped establish a rehabilitation program. Even as her own case moved toward resolution, she focused on others' healing. The most profound change came in unexpected ways. Jerry Banks, inspired by Sarah's forgiveness, began speaking at schools about the courage to choose truth over money. Officer Anderson established a police integrity unit. Even Michael Brooks, from his prison cell, provided evidence that helped overturn dozens of wrongful convictions. But it was Emily who became the movement's heart. Now properly cared for in a quality facility, she began painting scenes from Sarah's imprisonment. Her art, displayed in Springfield's finest gallery, captured both the darkness of injustice and the light of undimmed faith. One painting in particular caught national attention: Sarah in her cell, light streaming through bars, while outside her window a storm raged. Art critics called it naive. Those who knew the story called it prophetic. As spring flowers bloomed in Springfield, the movement Sarah inspired continued to grow. But she remained focused on personal rather than systemic change. Laws can be rewritten, she told Father Parker during a visit, but hearts must choose to change. The federal investigation expanded weekly, exposing corruption across multiple states. But in Springfield, something more profound was happening. People began to examine their own roles in maintaining injustice through silence or compliance. Churches filled. Community meetings overflowed. Citizens from all walks of life asked hard questions about privilege, power, and moral responsibility. And in her cell, Sarah continued to pray not just for justice, but for healing. Her journal entry from this period revealed her heart. Lord, let this pain serve your purpose. Let Springfield's awakening lead not to vengeance, but to transformation. And let us all remember that your light shines brightest in the darkest places. The stage was set for the final act in Sarah Miller's journey, one that would test not just the justice system, but the very soul of Springfield itself. On Easter Sunday, exactly 1 year after Catherine Thompson's death, Sarah Miller walked free. The morning sun painted Springfield's courthouse steps in gold as she emerged, Emily's wheelchair guided carefully beside her. The crowd's roar was deafening, but Sarah's first act was to kneel and kiss the ground. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. "Your timing is perfect." The state's exoneration was complete and unequivocal. Governor James Marshall himself attended the ceremony, offering a formal apology and expunging her record. The compensation package was substantial, millions in damages that Sarah immediately announced would fund a foundation for wrongfully convicted inmates. But it was the personal moments that moved witnesses to tears. Officer Anderson, now Springfield's reform-minded police chief, removed her handcuffs for the last time. Father Parker blessed her with trembling hands. And Emily, clear-eyed and calm for the first time in months, reached up to touch her sister's face. "You came back," Emily said simply, "like you promised." The Thompson family's presence added another layer of symbolism. Amanda Thompson, standing with the supporters, represented a new generation choosing truth over power. Judge Thompson, watching from his prison cell, was said to have wept at the televised proceedings. Sarah's first stop wasn't home, but Catherine Thompson's grave. The media kept a respectful distance as she laid white roses and knelt in prayer. "She tried to do right," Sarah told reporters afterward. "Her death brought truth to light. Now we honor her courage by building something better." The shelter welcomed her back with a celebration that brought together Springfield's transformed community. Old Pete had painted the walls. Maria Gonzalez cooked enough to feed an army. The homeless and wealthy sat together, sharing meals and stories of how Sarah's case had changed their lives. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah addressed the crowd. "I stand here not just as one person freed, but as witness to God's faithfulness. My imprisonment served its purpose to expose darkness and bring light. But now comes the harder work, building a community where such injustice can never take root again." Emily, watching her sister speak, began to sing their mother's favorite hymn. Others joined in until the shelter rang with hundreds of voices united in song. Even hardened reporters found themselves wiping away tears. The day ended quietly at their old home, restored by community volunteers during Sarah's imprisonment. As dusk fell, she sat on the porch with Emily, watching fireflies dance in the spring air. "Are you angry at them?" Emily asked suddenly. "The ones who hurt us?" Sarah was silent for a moment, considering. "No," she finally replied. "Anger chains us to pain. Forgiveness sets us free. And we've had enough of chains, haven't we?" Emily nodded, understanding more than most would guess. Together they watched the sun set on Sarah's first day of freedom, while across Springfield, lights began to twinkle like stars fallen to earth. The story of Sarah Miller's imprisonment was over, but her story of transformation was just beginning. 5 years after Sarah Miller's release, Springfield had become unrecognizable. The Miller Center for Justice, housed in the former Thompson Industries headquarters, stood as a beacon of reform. Its mission carved in stone at the entrance where faith meets justice, transformation begins. Sarah declined lucrative book deals and speaking tours, choosing instead to work directly with those affected by systemic injustice. The center provided free legal aid, counseling for families of inmates, and rehabilitation programs. Emily, now thriving in an innovative care program, created art therapy sessions for traumatized children. The ripple effects spread far beyond Springfield. 23 states reformed their death penalty procedures, citing the Miller standards for evidence review. Law schools studied her case as a testament to both institutional corruption and the power of resilient faith. Judge Thompson's death in prison sparked an unexpected final chapter. His last letter, released according to his wishes, was addressed to Sarah. "Your forgiveness haunts me more than my guilt. Catherine saw in you what I refused to see, that true power lies not in wealth or influence, but in unshakable faith. I die knowing I can never undo my sins, but thank God that your light exposed them." Sarah attended his funeral, the only non-family member present. Amanda Thompson stood beside her as they prayed over his grave. The shelter expanded into a full-service community center. Old Pete still maintained the heating system, telling newcomers proudly about the miracle winter when a storm stopped an execution. Father Parker, though retired, led weekly reconciliation sessions where former prosecutors sat alongside exonerated inmates, healing together. Officer Anderson, now teaching police ethics at the State Academy, brought every class to meet Sarah. Remember, he would tell his students, we saw justice fail, then watched a woman's faith rebuild it. But Sarah's most profound legacy was invisible to most. In quiet moments between public victories, she counseled countless souls through their own dark nights. Emily captured these scenes in a stunning series of paintings, her sister praying with a suicidal ex-judge, comforting Amanda Thompson through panic attacks, teaching former inmates to read bedtime stories to their children. On the 5th anniversary of her release, Springfield held a ceremony to rename the courthouse Plaza Miller Square. Sarah's speech was characteristically humble. This story was never about one woman's trial. It's about a community choosing light over darkness, truth over power, love over fear. Each time we help someone rise from their own prison, physical or spiritual, we honor not just my journey, but Catherine's courage and God's faithfulness. As she finished speaking, snow began to fall, gentle this time, like blessing. Emily wheeled forward to join her sister, their faces lifted to the sky. Around them, thousands of candles flickered in the dusk, held by people whose lives had been transformed. The storm that saved Sarah Miller had passed, but its cleansing power lived on. In Springfield and beyond, her story reminded people that even the darkest night contains seeds of dawn if only we have faith to endure until morning. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Dear friends, Sarah's powerful story of faith and redemption has touched all our hearts. If you've been moved by her incredible journey, please show your support by subscribing to our channel. It means the world to our team. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with your loved ones who might need a reminder of God's perfect timing. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Where were you watching from? How did Sarah's unwavering faith impact you? Should we create part 2, exploring Sarah's work at the Miller Center for Justice and the lives she transformed after her release? Let us know in the comments. Together we can spread more stories of hope and divine intervention.